But first, we know more or less where President Putin stands on the war with Ukraine. But what about his citizens, Russian people themselves? Russia's media is tightly controlled. In the West, it seems impenetrable. So how do we understand what Russians really think? Let's speak to Isabelle DeSisto, a researcher at Russian Watcher. It's a daily survey tracking Russian public opinion, run by political scientists at Princeton University in New Jersey. Isabelle, how does it work? How do you find out as accurately as you can what people are really thinking in Russia?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. The way that our surveys work, they're online. We've been tracking public opinion regarding the war in Ukraine and Russia since May 2022. We've gotten grants from several different agencies, both at Princeton and also from the federal government, to run daily on Princeton track public opinion in Russia over time. We use a marketing company that sends out targeted ads, and so that's how we're tracking the surveys. We get lots of questions about how much we can trust surveys. That's a whole different conversation. But I think one of the things that we can certainly do, in addition to loads of different tests survey researchers have developed for gauging public opinion towards sensitive issues and ensuring you're getting good data, we can also track opinion over time. And so even if you have issues as to how truthful people are being, you can certainly see trends over time. And with the high frequency data we have, that's exactly what we're able to do with indicators like support for what Russia calls the special military operation, approval of Vladimir Putin, whether people think the war is going successfully, attitudes toward negotiations, a very important topic, and so on.
And so, well, look, I mean, all of those things and more sound fascinating. What have you learned? Talk me through those trends. Let's start with the special military operation.
So one thing that we were perhaps surprised, perhaps not, to find is that throughout our time tracking this, and remember, this is hundreds and hundreds of surveys, we found fairly little change in attitudes toward the quote unquote special military operation. We see very stable support. Of course, the question of what support means is a much deeper one that can't be answered with a simple question on a scale of strongly to support to strongly oppose. What we've seen is the plurality of Russians, about 40%, regularly say that they strongly support the special military operation. About 20% or slightly over say they somewhat support it. So that's a majority of the population saying that they support the war. Now, it's worth noting that in our surveys, at least around 25% of people regularly continue to openly, on a survey administered online to strangers, oppose the war. And so that's quite significant as well. Even though it's not a large figure, 25% of a very large country really is something. However, we've seen extremely little change in this over time. And so that begs the question, are people static in their support for the war? And I would argue no. I don't think that the support for the war question is the best way to gauge attitudes. And that's simply because people are it's easier to, or perhaps better, to ask people more concrete questions. Support is a very sticky and tricky issue that includes a lot of different things, such as patriotism and so on. But what we like to do is ask people questions to get at attitudes more obliquely. For example, we can ask people whether they think things are going well. We can ask people whether they're, happy with the state of the economy, which has traditionally been an important pillar of support for the Putin regime. We can also ask people whether they feel personally threatened by the war. And these are really important ways by which we can get at what people really think. I'm not saying people are not answering the support question truthfully. I think the majority are, and that's an unfortunate reality we have to reckon with. But I think getting at the sort of deeper underlying reasons for what people say is important too. And crucially, we can also ask people what kind of strategies they support. in regards to the war. And so we regularly ask people, to what extent would you support the following types of strategies regarding the war in Ukraine? And, in Russian public opinion, researchers will, from across the discipline of political science and elsewhere, will tell you that people tend to follow the leader in a lot of respects. And so if Putin is favoring a certain policy, people will tend to agree, not necessarily, again, because they're lying, but because they sort of tend to agree with what he says. And you observe this phenomenon elsewhere as well. I'm sure supporters of a certain politician in Western democratic countries would do something similar. But we have seen pretty major shifts over time in support for different types of strategies in response to changes in the likelihood with which they would occur, in responses to crucially, changes in the media environment in Russia. And that's something really important to pay attention to as well, because if a certain strategy, such as negotiations, are being painted in the media as extremely unlikely and unfavorable to Russia, unsurprisingly, people will be much less likely to support that. But more recently, the dialogue around negotiations has been flipping and flopping very frequently, both in my country, the United States, I imagine in the UK and elsewhere. And so approval for negotiations is somewhere where we see an extreme amount of fluctuation relative to indicators for something like approval of Putin, which changes very little. And so recently, for example, from about, I would say, March or maybe even February through the end of May now, we've seen lots of changes in approval for negotiations.
And changes in which direction?
Well, that's a great question. After President Trump's inauguration, he famously or infamously perhaps claimed he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Of course, no one is surprised to see that didn't happen. I think at first you saw an increase in support, and I'm sort of looking here at some of my graphs. You saw an increase in support for negotiations, and then since April, we've seen a lot of shifts both up and down. And it's hard for me to tie that to specific events, but we've seen the President of the United States as well as the President of Russia really change their tune in a lot of different directions. At first, back in, I'm trying to remember when it was, I think February is when there was this sort of notorious visit of Zelensky to the White House. Perhaps it was the end of January. I can't remember the exact date. In any case, in Russia, that made Russia feel pretty good about their ability to enact some or exact some kind of concessions in potential negotiations. And so perhaps that could explain why you see an increase in approval. Of course, you'd be more likely to support negotiations if you think you're going to get a good deal.
And do you get any sense of how optimistic, how has that changed have over the entire course of the war?
That's a good question. I'd have to check at some of the more specific questions that we ask. I think, and this is now you're getting a bit more of my impressionistic sense, is that a lot of Russians try to put the war out of their mind to the extent that they can. And this is true of people throughout the world, I would guess, is that so long as it's not affecting your daily life, I think people are pretty keen to kind of try to go about their daily business without trying to let that take over your life in the way that it did perhaps in the early days when this is all that people were thinking about. But we do regularly ask about what kind of emotions people fear regarding the war. And we still get, I don't have the graphs in front of me, but we still do get a large fraction of people saying that they feel hopeful. We also get a lot of people who are quite angry. And I think that's an important emotion to pay attention to, because political scientists and psychologists as well will tell you that anger is a very motivating emotion, and that's a powerful one to pay attention to.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. That's Isabelle DeSisto from Russia Watcher, fascinating project.